The article that I'm about to read, it's a good couple weeks old at this point, but I think it's a very good teachable moment when it comes to what Hollywood thinks of its fans, its audience, or in other words, its paying customers, and the fact that the press, the media, some people call it the access media, Hollywood has them in their back pocket. People in the press, people in the access media, they have the exact same attitude towards fans or towards customers that Hollywood does. And the article, whether knowingly or not, explains a major fundamental reason why Hollywood is failing, why so many shows and movies are flopping, why the access media is losing influence, why fans are starting to trust the opinions and analysis of people on YouTube over people in the press. Yeah, there's quite a bit you can take from this article. Okay, so this article is from Variety and the subject is Toxic Fandom, or they call it Toxic Fandom. How Hollywood is battling fans who are just out for blood, from social media boot camps to superfan focus groups. And right from the get-go, notice how they word it. Hollywood is battling fans. Fans are your paying customer. Fans are the reason why movies can make a good $1 billion. Fans are the reason why the actors and actresses in Hollywood can make millions of dollars, why they can live in gated mansions. The fans are the reason why Disney is a company worth well over $100 billion. And yet, as the title of the article puts it, Hollywood is battling fans. They're fighting with fans. They're fighting with their paying customers. They're battling the very people who give them money. The very people who make them rich in the first place. I mean, make no mistake folks, any actor or actress in Hollywood, without the fans, they are nobody. If the audiences one day stop giving Hollywood its money, then Hollywood ceases to be relevant. So then why on earth would Hollywood be battling its fans? It seems pretty illogical to do that. Okay, so we start off on August 28th, Amanda Stenberg, the lead of the Star Wars series The Acolyte, posted an 8.5 minute video on her Instagram stories about Lucasfilm and their abrupt decision not to pick up the show for a second season, just a month after season 1's finale streamed on Disney+. It's not a huge shock for me, Stenberg said. Since the series was announced in 2020, she continued, we started experiencing a rampage of, I would say, hyper-conservative bigotry and vitriol, prejudice, hatred, and hateful language towards us. Stenberg was unavailable to comment for the story. In other words, The Acolyte was the latest high-profile target of toxic fandom, the catch-all term for when fan criticism hurtles from good faith dissatisfaction into a relentlessly negative, often bigoted online campaign against either the project or its stars or creative leaders. Okay, so right out of the gate, the article is saying that the fans are toxic, the fans are bigots, that poor Amanda Stenberg was a target of vitriol and hatred and a bunch of other words like that, and the rest of the cast was also targeted. What the article isn't mentioning though, is that Amanda Stenberg made this video at one point. We also had comments like this from cast members.
Because I feel like Star Wars is very patriarchal, so it was...
Then there were comments like this.
I mean, the best parts about Star Wars is there is no good or evil. It depends on what side you're standing on, truly.
You had a lot of baffling remarks from people in the cast and from the showrunner for The Acolyte, where they basically demonstrated that they had no understanding of Star Wars. And then you had cast members repeatedly talking about their own personal identity, hiding behind their personal identity. They talked a lot about how this is the most diverse cast for a Star Wars show ever, how it's historic and that sort of thing. But when you actually talk to the cast members about Star Wars, they demonstrate that they don't know anything about Star Wars. But the cast is diverse, so if you criticize them, then you're a bigot. You're a toxic fan. And this is a tactic that people in Hollywood use these days, and the access media is in on it. These parasites in Hollywood, and that's what they are parasites. They get their hands on a beloved franchise, a beloved IP. They inject their own activism into it, their own messaging into it. They disrespect the original characters. They disrespect the original lore. They change it. And then when you criticize them, they'll typically use the diversity of their cast as a shield against criticism and a spear. Anybody that dares to criticize their terrible show, their terrible movie, their terrible remake, whatever it might be, that person's a bigot. That person's a toxic fan. That person's an incel, whatever word they want to use. They gaslight the fans, they attack the fans, they fight with the fans, and then they wonder why that show ends up flopping, why it's got terrible viewership, why no one ends up liking it, and why it ends up getting canceled after one season, in The Acolyte's case. And with Amazon's Rings of Power, the exact same thing happened. The people working at Amazon and Rings of Power, they are not Lord of the Rings fans, they are activists. They are parasites who've gotten their hands on Tolkien's work, and they are actively polluting Tolkien's lore. And when Lord of the Rings fans simply call a spade, Amazon attacks the fans, they gaslight them, they call them bigots and racists. And while Amazon is trying to tell us that Rings of Power has been a pretty successful show, not really, no. Its viewership has not been that great. And why is that? Because these parasites in Hollywood, they're taking somebody else's work, somebody else's story, and they're turning it into a platform. They're injecting their own activism into somebody else's work, in their case Tolkien's work. And then they gaslight any fans who criticize what they're doing. So this article I'm reading from Variety, it uses the term toxic fandom. No, it's not the fans who are toxic, it's Hollywood that's toxic. And it's people like you in the access media who are toxic. It's not us fans. Alright, so the article goes on about the Acolyte. In a franchise economy increasingly dependent upon established audience devotion to drive the bottom line, the threat of toxic fandoms poisoning that enthusiasm has become a seemingly intractable headache for almost every studio, and it's only getting worse. It comes with the territory, but it's gotten incredibly loud in the last couple years, says a veteran marketing executive at a major studio. People are just out for blood regardless. They think the purity of the first version will never be replaced, or you've done something to upset the canon of a beloved franchise, and they're going to take you down for doing so. Yeah, criticism has gotten worse over the last few years, but you know why that is? Because you people in Hollywood are making worse products. You're making terrible products. You're showing zero respect for the franchises and IPs that you're taking over. That's why fan criticism has gotten so much worse over the last couple years. And fans are rightly criticizing people in Hollywood. The fans have done absolutely nothing wrong here. Rather, it's Hollywood and it's the access media who are at fault. If you're going to take somebody else's work and you're going to inject your ideology, your activism into somebody else's work, yeah, you bet fans are going to be upset with that. They're going to be rightly upset. And if you keep doing that sort of thing, then we the fans are going to continue criticizing you and we're not going to apologize for it. And you people in Hollywood seem to always forget that the reason why you have so much money is because we the fans give you money for making good products. Over the last 10 years or so, you people in Hollywood, you've shown zero interest in making anything good. You've shown zero interest in respecting any of the properties you take over. And we the fans, we simply see that and we respond accordingly. We criticize you and we stop giving you our money. And then instead of taking responsibility for what you're doing, you instead blame the fans. You blame the fans, you gaslight the fans, you shame the fans for not liking the garbage that you're creating. Sometimes toxic fandoms behave reactively. A House of the Dragon episode featuring 2 female characters kissing and an episode of The Last of Us focusing on a gay couple were both review bombed. The practice of mobbing sites like Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb with negative user reviews, which gained mainstream attention following the premiere of 2017 Star Wars The Last Jedi. And an entire YouTube ecosystem is devoted to declaring projects like The Marvels and The Boys woke garbage. Just as frequently, the backlash begins before the project has seen the light of day. A Reddit mega thread dedicated to outrage over Bridgerton casting a black woman as the love interest for Francesca. Social media epithets directed at the actors of color cast as elves and dwarves in Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. Death threats aimed at Leslie Jones during the press tour for 2016 Ghostbusters. And this right here, this is another tactic they use. They always claim that these cast members are receiving threats, but they never show evidence. They never give us any proof. With Star Wars The Last Jedi, Kelly Marie Tran, the press was claiming that she was bullied off of social media. Did they ever give us evidence? No. They simply say, these cast members are receiving threats, they're being bullied. We don't need to give you evidence because we're in the media, we're in the access media. Therefore, everything we say is infallible. Believe us without question. That's how this typically goes. Perhaps the greatest irony of this phenomenon is the disproportionate impact these toxic fandoms have relative to their actual number. The vast majority of any fandom are casual fans, says John Van Kitters, VP of Star Trek Brand Development, who has been with the storied franchise since the 1990s. The number of people who live and die on their franchises are very, very few, and then those who come after things that they espouse to love with venom are a really, really tiny subset of that already smaller subset of fandom. It's much easier to see it now. I don't know that it's really that much broader than where things were in 1995. It's just that the bullhorn wasn't there. And this right here is another tactic they try to use. They try to convince us that these fans criticizing Lord of the Rings for destroying Tolkien's lore, or criticizing The Acolyte or whatever other IP it might be, the people in the press, the people in Hollywood, they always try to convince us that these fans are a tiny vocal minority. That's usually the phrase they use, vocal minority. And it's not true. To be very blunt with you, these people are lying. Let's just go to Rotten Tomatoes and look at The Acolyte for a second. You look at the overall scores here, the critics, they like the show. Actual fans don't like the show. But look at how terrible this score is here. 18% here. Basically everyone hated The Acolyte. And yet they claim that these toxic fans are a tiny vocal minority. Those of you watching this, just use your common sense for a second. How does a tiny vocal minority produce a result this poor? This whole claim that these people are a vocal minority, it's not true. A vocal minority does not produce a result like this. The Acolyte was just a bad show, and the people at Lucasfilm are not willing to admit that. And by the way folks, this show got cancelled because its viewership was poor, and I mean real poor. Which is saying something because this is Star Wars we're talking about. Why do you think the viewership was so poor? Well, because a lot of the people that gave the show a chance, they decided it wasn't that good a show and then they tuned out, didn't bother finishing the season. And other people saw what cast members were saying in interviews calling Star Wars patriarchal, making some other very bizarre statements about Star Wars like Anakin blowing up the Death Star, saying that there is no good or evil in Star Wars. And they simply said, okay, this show's going to be terrible, I'm not going to bother watching it. And that's another thing, a lot of these quote-unquote toxic fans, they didn't even bother watching The Acolyte. If they did, this score right here, it would be even worse. So spare me of this claim that these toxic fans are a vocal minority. When these people in the press say that, they're lying. The article mentioned the Marvels. We'll take a look at the Marvels box office numbers. $206 million, that was all it made worldwide. If these toxic fans are a quote-unquote vocal minority, how does this movie only make $206 million? I mean, this movie lost Disney, I don't know the exact number, but a good few $100 million, couple $100 million. A so-called vocal minority is not going to have this big of an impact on a movie's box office. It's not. So this whole vocal minority thing, it's a myth. In reality, these quote-unquote toxic fans, they actually make up a majority of the audience. And these toxic fans, they're growing in number. Because the more Hollywood continues to disrespect their IPs, their franchises that they take over, the more people are noticing. And if they continue down this path, it's just going to continue. These toxic fans are only going to keep growing in number. For some, combating that bullhorn amounts to acting as if they can't hear it, particularly when it's a negative, toxic conversation we don't even engage, says a TV marketing executive. Like with toxic people, you try to not give it too much oxygen. One principal concern is that reacting to these kinds of attacks risk alienating fans who are unhappy with creative choices about a franchise but haven't tipped over into abusive behavior. So now they're calling fans this word right here. How are fans abusive? So Rings of Power fans are abusive when Amazon is destroying Tolkien's lore. If anyone's abusive, it's Amazon, not the fans. You had Disney disrespect Luke Skywalker the way they did in The Last Jedi, and yet it's the fans who are quote-unquote abusive? No, it's Disney. So a studio may attempt to amplify friendlier voices instead, will reply to comments that are positive and elaborate those things, said a TV exec. Still, toxic fandoms have grown so pernicious that they become a fact of life for many, and so powerful that while talent, executives, and publicists will privately bemoan the issue, fear of inadvertently triggering another backlash kept several studios from speaking for this story, even on background. As one rep put it, it's just a lose-lose. But I thought these toxic fandoms were just a vocal minority. Why do you bemoan the issue so much? This isn't making sense. Those who did talk to Variety all agree that the best defense is to avoid provoking fandoms in the first place. Yeah, I'd say I agree with that. If Amazon showed respect to Tolkien's lore, fans wouldn't be complaining. If Disney didn't treat Luke Skywalker the way they did in The Last Jedi, Star Wars fans wouldn't have been complaining. It is not the fans who are toxic, it's Hollywood who's toxic. And Hollywood is poisoning franchises like Star Wars, like Lord of the Rings, and countless other properties. All the fans are doing is calling it out. In addition to standard focus group testing, studios will assemble a specialized cluster of super fans to assess possible marketing materials for a major franchise project. When you say super fans, do you mean people like this? They're very vocal, says a studio exec. They will just tell us if you do that, fans are going to retaliate. These groups even led studios to alter the projects. If it's early enough and the movie isn't finished yet, we can make those kinds of changes. Several studio insiders say they often put their talent through a social media boot camp in some cases when a character is intentionally challenging a franchise's status quo. The studios will, with the actor's permission, take over their social media accounts entirely. When things get really bad, especially involving threats of violence, security firms will scrub talent information from the internet to protect them from doxing. Again, they're claiming these people are receiving threats, but they never provide evidence. And I'll tell you this, folks. A few Lucasfilm employees could easily create fake accounts online and then send bad messages to cast members for Star Wars shows like The Acolyte or whatever else. You could fake this stuff pretty easily. Later that year, the cast of Rings of Power condemned the relentless racism, threats, harassment, and abuse some of our castmates of color are being subjected to on a daily basis. And actors from Lord of the Rings trilogy posted photos of themselves wearing clothing featuring the ears of Middle-earth creatures in multiple skin tones underneath the message "You are all welcome here" written in Elvish. Those efforts may have had an effect. In an August interview with MGM Studios TV chief Vernon Sanders about Rings of Power, the executive said the show hadn't experienced the same racist hostility in advance of season 2 that had greeted its 2022 debut. People have had a chance to actually engage with the show, he said. Overwhelmingly, what we've seen is that folks who came with an open mind and can discuss and debate their favorite things, which takes you out of the place of that ugly conversation that happened with some folks who have been infused with an agenda that's separate from the show itself. Again, they're not providing proof. He says folks who may have been infused with an agenda, referring to fans. No, it was Amazon who was infused with an agenda. Amazon's agenda was to destroy Lord of the Rings, to remake it, reimagine it, to current day it. And there's nothing toxic about the fans calling that out. There's nothing toxic about criticizing Amazon for taking Tolkien's work and injecting their own activism into it. It's not Lord of the Rings fans who are toxic, it's Amazon. And why do they appear to be receiving less negative criticism for the show in season 2? Well, perhaps it's because a lot of Lord of the Rings fans have stopped watching the show. And if they're not watching the show anymore, then that means they're not spending their time or their energy criticizing it. Yeah, folks, make no mistake, the people in Hollywood, they hate you. People in the access media, they hate you. They like your money, but they've also taken your money for granted over the last several years. The reason why they're so mad at fans, the reason why they hate the fans so much, is because these people in Hollywood, they're not entertainers, they're activists. And they're parasites. They are parasites whose goal is to get their hands on franchises like Star Wars, like Lord of the Rings, like countless other IPs out there. And their goal is to take those franchises and inject their own messages, their own activism, their own ideology into them. Whether it be their woke ideology, their fempowerment ideology, and whatever else. And they're upset that fans are not happy with what they're doing. And in response to fan criticism, they're lashing out at the fans, they're lashing out at the audience. Or in other words, they're lashing out at their own paying customers. And if you want people to give you their money, that's not exactly a successful formula. And we've been seeing it over the last few years now. Hollywood's been producing one flop after another. They do make an occasional good movie, but oftentimes it's just by accident. But Lucasfilm, they've been struggling. Disney as a whole, they've struggled over the last few years. They did make 2 box office hits in Deadpool and Wolverine and Inside Out 2, but over the last couple of years as a whole, Disney has not been doing well, and neither has Hollywood as a whole. And much of the reason why is because they don't respect their audiences. In fact, they despise their audiences. They call their fans toxic and whatever other names. And then the end result you get is Hollywood being at war with its paying customers. Franchises like Star Wars are dead. Hollywood's producing one flop after another because fans have decided to stop giving Hollywood their money. And people in Hollywood, instead of looking in the mirror, instead they lash out at the fans. They lash out at their own paying customers. Not exactly a formula for success. Everyone, I hope you enjoy this video, and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.